So today I would like to show you a new project that we have been working on, and I think this new product is going to revolutionize the way players interact with each other.
Fucking Marla job. Alright, Damien. Let's see if there's something there is.
Yo, Maurice! Yo, what's shaking, motherfucker? Shit! Game's almost over. We are out of time. Nice shot.
I'd been to E3 a few times by 2012, but that was the first year I got into any of the big pre-show press conferences while writing for Flesh-Eating Zipper. Sony didn't confirm me until nearly the last minute, so I sighed with relief that I was going at all. While I enjoyed their beer garden and their on-stage Last of Us and Wonderbook demos, it sounds like my colleagues a few miles over at the Ubisoft conference were getting the better show. Looking at Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo's offerings, it was, as predicted, an awkward stall of a year before the next generation of consoles were due. But Ubisoft was showing something big and new for consoles you already owned. I've known about Ubisoft for a while, but they didn't catch my eye until the early aughts, when they expanded their Tom Clancy brand of military tactical combat titles in every direction. With a new wave of consoles due out by the mid-decade, they shifted their weight to their current strategy, building large, exotic sandbox games that built on the genre after Grand Theft Auto 3 showed the world that they were possible. The first big bang came with Assassin's Creed, built on Ubisoft Montreal's success with puzzle platformer remake Prince of Persia. Touring Dark Age religious settlements like Jerusalem from tip to toe on your way to dispatch various corrupt officials and evildoers, Assassin's Creed was fun in the moment-to-moment action and free climbing. But the skeletal narrative meant tedium set in incredibly fast. Ubisoft iterated quick while launching a new series with Far Cry 2, a completely retooled action sandbox based very loosely on the franchise they purchased from Crytek. It was also rough, but like Assassin's Creed, they struck gold with their second iteration, Far Cry 3, and are building Far Cry 4 on the same ideas. But we didn't know all these things in the summer of 2012 when we saw Ubisoft's new Sandbox game. With animated infographics that would make a Wired art editor squeal, the company's new flagship franchise pitched us on a future in which Chicago's entire infrastructure is looped through a centrally managed operating system called CTOS. As hacker hacktivist Aidan Pierce, you use a superphone to exploit everything from superficial information on everyone around you to the flow of traffic. The pitch was smooth. It was even incredibly relevant, coming a year before Edward Snowden's disclosures that the NSA had been spying on the phone records of US citizens. We'd see an equally passionate take on the theme when Sucker Punch unveiled infamous Second Son at Sony's PlayStation 4 reveal months later.
In 2011, the US government seized the personal cell phone records of 1.3 million of its citizens. There are 1,200 of us in here today. 4 of us have been monitored.
Second Son would eventually ship before Watch Dogs, but we'll get to that. While Watch Dogs was announced for then current consoles like the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, it was obviously too good for any console of the era to run, at least as it was shown. Early cross-generation titles like this rarely took advantage of new hardware that didn't have names or release dates yet. Yet this game looked incredible. It was a game that would have had to be nerfed for the current systems, and not fully take advantage of next-gen systems either. It was an odd position to be in, but par for the course for a first-round next-gen game. But while my colleagues were impressed with what they saw in the theater that day, I was a little more skeptical watching the footage roll down from the press site. There was something that didn't quite settle with me about the idea of hacking your way through the sprawling mass of a city-controlling digital behemoth playing an amoral protagonist. Not on paper, though. On paper, Watch Dogs sounds right on every front. The government is always watching, a simple hack grants you unlimited control of everything, and you're in a vast urban environment with limitless potential to be a digital savior or anonymous malicious freak. It's great, isn't it? No, something seemed off about the idea of passively interacting with the world through a technological intermediate. My expectations were low when the game arrived 2 years later, but I'd hoped that Ubisoft would be able to dodge the bullet of Sandbox 1.0 blues that affected its sister franchises. Well, they didn't. Let me explain. There are many things you can forgive about a game if playing it's fun. But as I mentioned, something didn't feel right about playing Watch Dogs from its unveil. Spend a few minutes playing it beyond the tutorial and you begin to understand why. At any moment, moving around Watch Dogs takes place in one of 3 modes, which is roughly one more mode than any other Sandbox game. By default, you're in what I call pedestrian mode. You can walk around, you can get into cars, but you can't interact with the world. As you brush by people, reticles float over them, like passing headlamps on a nightly trip down the highway. You don't know anything about these people other than they're targets for your eavesdropping or manipulation. In this mode, you quickly realize you can't even jump of your own will. You lack much of the game's utility. It's actually a useless state of play because you can't use any of the tools that the game banks on. This brings us to the other 2 primary modes of play. Pressing separate buttons brings you into hacking, which the game refers to as profiler mode, or the combat mode. Watch Dogs places such an emphasis on hacking and your interaction with the digital layer of this recreated Chicago that they replaced the X button with it, which is some prime controller real estate. It's also somewhat confusing if you've ever played any other action game because you'll find yourself hacking something rather than, say, reloading your weapon in a hairy situation. It's in hacking mode that the world opens up to you, and for whatever reason, Ubisoft felt the need to hide all this interaction under a button press, consistently goading you to switch over to hacking mode to use it. So why not integrate hacking into the moment-to-moment gameplay? I can think of 2 reasons. The information panel that displays superficial and rather pointless information about the people around you takes up a considerable amount of visual real estate, and Ubisoft would need to contrive a reason for Aiden not to be staring at his superphone screen at all times to get this information. Both of these seem like insanely easy fixes. Deus Ex and System Shock figured this out a decade ago, or longer, without a special tricorder mode. Why can't Ubisoft figure it out? So anyway, now you're in hacking mode and the world around you is screaming for your attention at every turn, prompting you to press that darling hack button to do anything from downloading new tracks for your in-game music library to deploying traffic barriers. In other Sandbox games, people are world filler, almost literally. Running around empty environments is scary and negates the illusion of being in a big and living, breathing world. In Watch Dogs, examining people with your superphone reveals randomly generated intentions. You can drop in on text conversations and phone calls. It's easy to fall for the puppet show, but I was just too focused on the strings pulling these mannequins along. In creating a population with 1 million individual stories, they expose what amounts to an elaborate amount of window dressing. It's not that these bits of information are useless. Some lead you to random crimes around the city for you to solve that help your credibility, but others are just bank accounts to pilfer or songs to download. If you only create profiles for the people who have something for you to interact with, the world feels that much emptier, right? Well, this puppet show still makes the world feel empty. This carries over to the moments you're driving as well. The game pings you at every disruptible intersection or rollaway garage door as you cut through downtown Chicago. Almost all of these prompts are useless unless you're being pursued by the police or other foes, and even then, the game guides you to the exact moment when you should use them. Of course, that's only if you've unlocked the ability to use most of these distractions. Otherwise, they're just sitting there useless. These prompts shouldn't even exist, but the game has to remind you at all times that you are a super-powered hacktivist with the glories of God at the tip of your thumb, even if they amount to very little at any given moment. Why doesn't the game just auto-prompt you to use your powers and spare you the information overload? Is Ubisoft trying to tell us something about the dangers of multitasking by muddying its gameplay mechanics? Compounding this is that the ability to hack has given Watch Dogs designers carte blanche to mitigate useful gameplay components from other games, like the aforementioned ability to jump at any time. Despite Aiden Pierce's uncanny abilities behind the wheel, the gun, or his superphone, he just can't scale a building like his assassin's cousins can. He needs to solve a linear walking puzzle in which he finds and activates lifts to get to the top of a high tower to scout out an area. It takes the highlight of playing other games like Assassin's Creed or Far Cry and sucks the joy just right out. Oh, Aiden can vault over things, but not freely and sometimes not when you absolutely expect him to. While behind the wheel, Watch Dogs prohibits you from shooting at enemies. Sure, it's an unwieldy task in other games because, well, that makes sense. The game removes this component entirely, directing you toward the hundreds of roadside obstacles to take down your foes instead. This means Especially when you're trying to take down larger armored vehicles, you'll need to follow your target until they fall into enough player-inflicted damage zones. It's boring. Watch Dogs, by creating this techie gameplay veneer, places you a step further from the action than its contemporary. Playing Watch Dogs feels very passive, because for the vast majority of the time you're on foot, you're just pressing a button, so that Aiden Pierce can press a button on his phone so that you can mutually accomplish something together. But it's so limiting. This is a game where hacking a helicopter doesn't give you control of the helicopter, it just lets you spy through its cameras. This is a game where melee is a combat option, but only when the game lets you use it. This is a game where it forces you to hop between camera views over and over and over again to reach distant hacking targets. Again, passive. By making a big game in which hacking is the only way to interact with the world or enjoyment, you feel more detached and less interested. As a result, hacking in Watch Dogs isn't really much fun at all. It's just a large means to several ends. The solution then is that Watch Dogs doesn't need to sacrifice the moment-to-moment action gameplay that makes other Sandbox successful just to emphasize your digital interactions. Let Aiden scale walls and shoot out of his car. Let him put the phone down and slap Google Glass on his face so he can actually interact with the world. This doesn't need to be a mutually exclusive thing between hacking and action. But here's the thing, when Aiden has his phone tucked away and isn't just wandering the streets in the vestigial pedestrian mode, he does great. I'm talking about the third mode now, Watch Dogs Combat, and it is fantastic. Hitting a shoulder button and whipping out a firearm from underneath your trench coat is satisfying. If you don't have a positive reputation, people will even freak out and call 911. It's incredibly clever. The combat itself is largely derivative of Gears of War's stop-and-pop gameplay, but it's faster, and equipped with some key gadgets, it even incorporates the ability to approach any situation with stealth, without the game ever prompting you to the possibility. There are no binary, be stealthy, or blow up these guys tutorials in Watch Dogs. Every situation is fluid. Like Metal Gear, and unlike Splinter Cell or Thief, you aren't relying on a jewel or stealth bar to evaluate how well your enemies can see you. The enemies serve as the detector themselves, allowing you to adapt quickly when the situation changes. It is very, very good, allowing you to get violent quick, then fade into the background just as fast. Because the game's economy is incredibly broken, and money can be stolen from passers-by without any penalty whatsoever, acquiring guns and ammo is merely a matter of want, than time or progress. Still, the starter silenced pistol wound up being my favorite go-to weapon while sneaking around warehouses and bad guy compounds. My only real issue with Watch Dogs Combat comes with the fact that you can't blind fire at enemies from behind cover. Oh, one other thing, that same shoulder button to retrieve your firearm is the same one you use to craft your gadgets, so I often freaked out nearby civilians and started several unintentional police chases just because I wanted to crate stuff. Yeah, it's weird. Augmenting your ability to hack, fight, and drive are Aiden's skills. The various talent trees either tweak your abilities, allow you to manipulate more hackable objects in the environment, or add new craftable devices like jam comms or various explosives. You're also granted the early ability, should you choose to accept it, to add focus, which is Watch Dogs' version of slow-mo. It can be deployed at any time with a funky dancing bar that indicates how much focus you have available. It's a superfluous add-on that doesn't really make much sense considering how vanilla Aiden Pierce is as a character. I never used it during car chases, but I have to give it to Watch Dogs. It is a blast to use during gunplay. These abilities all seem pretty slight, but you'll gain enough progression points quick enough to unlock the whole tree long before the end of the campaign.
Bloom operator, please.
Hello?
The most fun you can have in Watch Dogs comes from the gang hideouts, which take a page out of Far Cry's book. While slashing down outposts in Far Cry 2 was rough, Ubisoft hit the nail on its head with the sequel. With Watch Dogs, you're given access to a huge number of these hives of scum and villainy through side quests, random crimes, and a variety of campaign missions. The premise is simple. A bunch of bad dudes are staked out in a zone and you need to take them all down. Or you may need to melee a specific target instead of killing him outright. Using the hideout's cameras, or your own legwork, you can mark your targets, much like Far Cry 3 or Splinter Cell, allowing you to keep tabs on combatants as you move around. Because of the game's robust combat chemistry, how you choose to move through these challenges is robust. If you fail, it's because of a decision you made, rather than the game cheating. Adding some depth is the addition of characters that can call in reinforcements if alerted, but can be disrupted through your superphone. There are also plenty of environmental hazards littered throughout the level for you to blow up your enemies, including plenty of situations that let you prime enemy grenades while they're still hanging on their person. Fun as these moments may be, they often raise your profile a bit too much to be enjoyable, especially when all the bad guys immediately swarm on you as a result. Watch Dogs' gang hideouts don't pack the full punch of Far Cry's Outpost because there's no serendipitous wildlife slinking in to alter your plans mid-stride, and it's relatively static in that regard. But there's also no land grab mechanic in Watch Dogs either, like Saints Row, which brings us to the next chapter of our story.
It's been over 3 years since implementing the first CTOS station and 1 year of citywide operations. When planning for CTOS...
Watch Dogs isn't my first go-around with an interactive Chicago. As far back as 1999, I was hurtling through these streets in Midtown Madness. But the game that really impressed me with its attention to detail was another Microsoft game, Project Gotham Racing 2. That game had an eye for the little things, like geography or ESPN zones. Of course, it wound up being our least raced city, primarily because 90-degree turns aren't much fun in a racing game. I don't know much about Chicago itself beyond games, movies, and Wikipedia entries, but while Watch Dogs Chicago felt like a pretty good reproduction, something felt off about this too, especially when compared to other sandboxes in Ubisoft's stable, or competitors like Saints Row, Grand Theft Auto, or Just Cause. If Watch Dogs isn't fundamentally interesting to play, surely Ubisoft went to task to make sure that the stuff you did inside its world was interesting, right? To understand why the Chicago didn't feel right, I tried to compare it to other worlds objectively. So I created the OBI-OP system, and rated 5 categories that all action-oriented sandboxes require. First off, the game needs to have scale and opportunities. It needs to have things to do. If it's not geographically huge, at least plug it with side quests or useful distractions. Just Cause 2 nails this by having one of the largest open worlds ever created for a single-player game, with hundreds of outposts and establishments to destroy in a variety of biomes. Then you need buildings, structures, or set pieces to serve as mission targets. Red Faction Guerrilla does this well by making the structures completely destructible. In Saints Row, you get used to the nooks and crannies of the cities because you're scouring the city grid, conquering it bit by bit for economic and character benefits. Sandboxes need roads and infrastructure to get you between these mission markers, and using the game's vehicles needs to be a fun experience. Yeah, pretty much every game has them, even if you rarely use them. A game like Grand Theft Auto 4 gets a poor score here because getting around on foot is slow, and using the game's vehicles, complete with their cruise liner handling, is required and uncomfortable. Its sequel, however, goes the extra mile by not only fixing the handling, but also featuring triathlons with biking and on-foot races, which was a highlight of that game. Seriously. Then you need open space. You don't need the rolling hills and countryside of Grand Theft Auto 5, but you do need to give players room to breathe and explore from time to time. Binding the world with roads and buildings can be restrictive and boring when the available missions aren't very enticing. Lastly, an open world needs periphery. This is usually where the most radical and fun components live. Since most sandbox games are based on islands, maybe large ones, it can be a bore to simply drive from point to point. This is where you include flying and swimming missions that augment all the stuff you're doing on the ground. This literally opens a whole new dimension to the game. Just Cause 2, in particular, lets you grapple and parachute all over the world with easily accessible air and watercraft. So with these outlined, how do some of these games compare? Red Faction Guerrilla does so well with building, smashing, and world traversal that the inability to fly seems okay. Infamous builds its fun into being a superhero flying up and down buildings in dense urban environments, but it's a bit on the short side as far as content and scope. Just Cause 2 and Grand Theft Auto 5 know how to build epic worlds and populate them with fun things to do. They're sandbox environments that simply can't be beat in terms of the width, depth, and height of their offerings. So let's get to Watch Dogs, starting with the stronger points. Watch Dogs Chicago is pretty big, and while there are plenty of activities, not many of them are captivating. Street races and checkpoint dashes are perfunctory, but there's enough gang hideouts to go on for some time. The game will randomly populate new crimes for you to prevent, but they're simple affairs. Oh, and how interested are you in camera hopping to scan QR codes painted in forced perspective onto structures in the world, or play reduced versions of chess? Yeah, I kinda figured. Watch Dogs roads and infrastructure are solid because the driving is solid. I know some people had problems with how the vehicles handle, but I enjoy that they have some weight to them. This becomes especially true during police chases when heavy cruisers battle you off the road. The ever-present hacking prompts aren't detrimental, but they are kinda silly. Why would you ever raise traffic barriers and bridges when you're not being chased by the law? Are those electronic traffic signs supposed to be funny? Puzzling still, the game never automatically drops GPS routes to direct you to your next mission. You'll need to set those manually with every single new directive. It's here that I should also mention that while I've never been a big fan of most licensed music in Sandbox games, Watch Dogs Radio is the saddest collection of songs I've ever heard. It's as if they went to the licensing vault and randomly picked out a bunch of uninteresting music. The only song I didn't skip was Kid Cudi's 5-Year-Old Day and Night. Thankfully, the game lets you shut off the radio by default. This won't, however, prevent the multitude of news broadcasts that stiffly inform you of the things you just did or remind you of how much the citizens of Chicago love or hate you. There are plenty of decent cars in Watch Dogs, so like many other Sandbox games with Cars on Demand's features, I usually just jacked whatever vehicle was closest to me whenever I needed one, rather than buying one through the catalog. You'll probably avoid the big bulky vans, and the more affluential downtown districts have a higher concentration of exotic cars than the slums do, but for the most part, the car selection is pretty milquetoast, for better or worse. Watch Dogs has little open space to speak of. There are some grassy fields and spare rail yards on the margins, but the game doesn't do anything with them. On one hand, any large open area that isn't chock full of CTOS hack prompts is kinda antithetical to the premise of hacking everything around you. On the other hand, it makes Pawnee, which is the quote-unquote rural district, feel incredibly constricting. Scrunched into the northwest map corner, there's no farmland or open air here, just a bunch of cramped canyons and a tight waterfront area. The game tricks you into believing it's further out from the city than it actually is by forcing you down a long winding highway to get there. To that end, it rarely ever tells you to go out there, and like the rest of the game's open areas, it only really serves as a way to ditch cops in the most inefficient way possible, or as a segment for the game's races. The game has plenty of buildings, but does absolutely nothing with them. The suburbs house bars and blown-out warehouses for firefights, but for the most part, you spend a lot of your time zooming around the bases of massive and non-interactive concrete monoliths. There's also very little verticality. Willis Tower is here, but you can't climb into an elevator and look down from the sky deck or out onto Lake Michigan to soak in the game's scope. It's really a missed opportunity. That, of course, brings us to the periphery. Remember that helicopter I mentioned earlier? You still can't fly it. There are no airplanes, no jetpacks. Fine. Okay. But there are boats. There are no boat races, however, and there are no ski-doos. There's really no reason to use any of the provided boats at all, actually. The map is far too tight to make use of them aside from a quick escape. Overall, Watch Dogs Chicago, despite its size and content, feels constrictive and sparse, undercooked even. It hangs its hopes so much on being hacker-friendly that it's not a very interesting or fun place to be on its own. There's no joy in just rolling down the street in your stolen ride. You can't even make much of your own fun because of how restrictive the city is. There's another small wrinkle to my criticism of Watch Dogs Chicago, and that's in the authenticity. There are a variety of sightseeing points where you can check in using a Foursquare-like app. But because of the partially fictionalized nature of this world, the factoids ranged from, accurate enough to pause the game and read the Wikipedia entry about it, to outright fabrication without giving me so much as a wink and a nod as to which ones were true or not. I also didn't realize that Chicago's history was so grim, full of murders, gang wars, and little else. Finally, they couldn't even clear the rights to use the famous Cloudgate sculpture in Millennium Park. I mean, if you're in charge of licensing at Ubisoft, how do you get that one wrong? So if the gameplay is competent, but hindered by hacking mechanics that subtract as much as they add, and the environment you play in is an uncomfortable mash of things you can't do, and boring things that you can, the story that binds this entire experience must be pretty great to compensate for these kinds of misgivings, right? Well, no. Watch Dogs' story is absolutely terrible.
Cops are closing. He's on the move.
All right, get to your vehicle fast. I want everyone to track Pierce and protect him, at least for now.
Capping the game's unveil, we got an epic teaser for what could have been a mighty multiplayer mode.
Tracking Pierce, you got it?
I copy. 30 seconds away.
Looks pretty great, huh? A kind of pseudo-MMO-ish asymmetrical co-op? I know it's a pain to describe, but as a gamer, your brain can automatically explode with the possibilities that Ubisoft pitched us. It's unfortunate then that nothing resembling this World of Hackers mode ever came to be.
That shit doesn't even faze me right now because I'm about to hit a fat ass ball.
That's not to say Ubisoft wasn't clever, they just weren't nearly clever or ambitious enough when it came to the multiplayer modes that shipped on the disc. Yes, this game has races, and they're fine, competent, but unimaginative. There's an open world mode that isn't any fun, but the basket Watch Dogs puts most of its eggs in is in its hide-and-seek hacker mode. As the hacker in these one-on-one matches, you need to evade your mark while downloading all of their data. As the mark, you only have so much time to find your hacker before they get away with your data. You need to use your hacking mode to determine who they are. As time advances, the search bubble contracts to help you out, but you're also running out of time. It's probably fun a few times, namely the few times that the game's main campaign forces you into these matches, but on top of the game's other modes, I didn't have any fun with Watch Dogs multiplayer and only came back to capture the footage you see here. Again, another missed opportunity.
Did you just call yourself a hoe? Well, if the shoe fits, wear it.
Find you, that's all I know, man! That's all I know! Give me a name.
Watch Dogs opens and closes with the same choice. Here you are, the mercenary Aiden Pierce, hovering over a broken and whimpering hitman named Maurice. It's almost clever. You see, in the E3 unveil, I got the impression that Pierce was an empire-building hacker god who wanted to send a message to rival kingpins and internet-enabled miscreants that Chi-Town was his turf, haunting in a very Walter White kind of way. Instead, Pierce winds up as the victim of an overwrought and completely unrealistic soap opera that goes everywhere but interesting. It fits then that the first time you meet Maurice, your only option is to shoot him, to prove that you are the big boss. But you don't kill Maurice, because that would ruin the flimsy framing device and prevent you from reflecting on your hero's journey at the end of Watch Dogs' long and arduous campaign. But who the hell is Maurice? Well, let's back up a bit. As the game opens, you're waltzing around the lobby of the Hotel Merlot, while your once-upon-a-time mentor and hacker pal Damien serves as your eye in the sky. You're here for money, cold hard cash in digital bits and bytes. When a second hacker begins to penetrate the Merlot's network, though, a line gets stripped and you're forced to abort. It's not long afterward that you're tracked down and our pal Maurice is dispatched to take care of you, in an incident that instead kills your young niece. Now, I'm not going to argue the validity of chaining the emotional core of this 15 to 20 hour campaign to the murder of a young girl, because they could have really pulled it off with flying colors. Instead, it serves as a heavy anchor to everything else that follows, grounding any imperialistic ambition Aiden may have and reducing him to a mere fish in other people's ponds. It also shrouds the debate of Aiden's morality by not really caring either way what you do, which makes the Maurice dilemma that much more confusing by the end. It doesn't take too long playing Watch Dogs to make you feel that no one had a grand vision for Aiden Pierce. Instead, it feels like Ubisoft purchased a season's worth of unsold scripts for a crappy techno-thriller TV series, then sanded their individual awful climaxes down into a confusing mess. Characters appear and disappear, motives are contrived and forgotten, and in one instance toward the end of the game, you spend 2 hours chasing down a dead mouse look-alike in a station wagon, only for him to disappear into the ether when the thrill is over, like a campy comic book villain.
I doubt this is the last I've seen of Default.
Not helping things is the lazy writing that tends to forget where it is, like some sort of stumbling drunk.
Tell me you got something.
It was only a partial download, but I definitely got something.
It's encrypted.
You said it's encrypted.
Everything all right?
I didn't get much. The upload was cut off. Shit. Even if you did get inside there, we can't read it. It's encrypted.
There are a number of factions introduced in this game, but since the game lacks any territorial grab aspect, they serve mainly as mobs to feed the narrative. Who are the viceroys, and why should we care about them?
Bad bug doesn't even mean anything.
Yeah, it does. A bad bug can get into any lady's bed.
That's disgusting.
Why would their boss, a war veteran, call himself Iraq? Now, I guess that actually does make sense. In a silly kind of way.
Weasel!
Why, in a game that lives and dies on its theme of technologies entwining with our moment-to-moment culture, would the anonymous hacker hive mind, DeadSec, serve as little more than background noise?
This is a secure site. By design, it's untraceable, unhackable.
Yet here we are about the hacking.
Every time the story goes somewhere interesting, they toss the conclusion away as some tease to set up some Watch Dogs sequel.
Remember when we were kids? And I would follow you.
So then we get to the morality of the whole thing, which Watch Dogs is the most confused about. It has no idea what lesson it wants to teach you, and unlike other Sandbox games that are ambivalent to your character's actions, this one is so self-serious that it quickly makes its own arguments incredibly awkward. You see, a hitman just killed Aiden's innocent niece, and he spends the entire game brooding about it. Aiden Pierce is a bummer.
I need you someplace safe. That's what makes me strong.
But in the same breath, he has no issue knocking off anyone who's merely in his way.
I can't keep him alive.
Oh. No, I guess not.
My sister's missing, Clara. I'm gonna do whatever it takes to get her.
He mutters to himself about this over and over again, just as confused about his dualistic motivations as the player is.
What did I do? I killed every one of them. How many people have I hurt? Killed? Who deserves to die? Who decides that?
His niece's death enforces an image of you being a moral crusader. Random crimes appearing across the map enforce this notion as well, because you can only save your fellow citizens. You can't decide to divvy up the purse money or what have you. At the same time, the story has you doing some really evil stuff and knocking people off just for the sake of relieving some narrative tension. In other games, this can work, but Ubisoft clearly never thought this through. For all we know, this story was cobbled together in the 11th hour around set pieces and missions that already existed in another form that didn't work out. When we see Maurice again, in a break during the ending credits, you're given the option to spare or dispatch him, but after 20 to 30 hours of playing Watch Dogs, your decision becomes a meaningless and superficial exercise because you don't care, and by proxy, neither does Aiden. Complain what you will of the binary angelic good or satanic evil choices of games like Infamous, BioShock, or Star Wars The Old Republic, but at least they provide some consequences in making consistent choices. Watch Dogs sets up the bowling pins, then locks up the alley. Maurice, the first and last decision you'll make in Watch Dogs, eventually serves as a metaphor for the terrifying shamble that is this game's story and how poorly the game treats your many, many choices. Implying weighty morality, but providing little to no circumstance, and certainly no constructive conversation. So what of Aiden Pierce, the proposed hero of this franchise and tentpole attraction of any further games to bear the Watch Dogs name? Well, what about him? Do we ditch him like Assassin's Creed's Altair and get someone genuinely interesting? There are a variety of audio logs littered throughout the city filling in background detail on central characters, but we don't know that much about Aiden's motivations or where he comes from. We know he enjoys his baseball cap and trenchcoat motif, but why does he do the things he does? Why does he become a hacker? How does he live this life? There are other questions, like where the hell does his phone come from, and why does no one else have the same one? Why aren't the police seconds away from every crime that CTOS warns you about? Do they not get the same alerts? See, a mystery would be fun, but these are just bizarre and unrealistic omissions. It seems that the only decent character in this merry-go-round is CTOS itself. The only entity that seems to evolve as you learn how to manipulate it. Seems like no one else can stop talking about it, like it's the hottest celebrity in town. I also enjoyed the ins and outs of your psychopathic companion Jordy, but they just didn't give him enough screen time. They should really just give him the second game entirely.
We could just do that. Do that.
You're gonna pay for that, T-Bone!
Yeah. You owe the man $100.
So you have a game that's not a lot of fun to play, an environment that's not fun to be in, bound to a story that's an absolute train wreck. The mock reviews are coming in and that Metacritic score isn't going to be great. It's October 2013, a month away from release, and you're about to tell the team to wrap up the assets because the game is about to be sent off to replication to fill millions of pre-orders and next-generation console bundles. What do? Well, if you're Ubisoft, you have an epiphany and slam the brakes. You delay the game for half a year and tell the team to fix the problems. As an observer, it's hard to quantify what exactly changed in those extended months of development, but the introduction of some new modes indicates that the best they could workshop were some bolt-on experience that cribbed from the imagination and flamboyance of other more adventurous games. I'm not even mad. Yeah, every game should spend more time copying colorful indie games and Saints Row. I just wish Ubisoft had looked into it years ago when they were building their grim adventure, rather than at the tail end of development. The results are, interesting. Let's knock out the bad stuff first. The augmented reality games are awful. Turning Watch Dogs into a boring 3D platformer, or shooter sci-fi thing, is a bad call. I understand how these fit into the universe considering how powerful your in-game phone is, but they're only theoretically clever distractions. Where the real fun begins are in the digital trips, which are what Watch Dogs suggests would have happened to MP3s if Napster had flourished. There are a series of standalone games that, if cooked a bit more thoroughly, could be entertaining games on their own merit. Each game is round-based with individual skill trees to acquire better skills to achieve bigger goals. My favorite, of course, is Spider Tank, in which you control the eponymous mech to crush, kill, and destroy various objectives. It's honestly the most fun in the game, and it's here that you see the limitations of Watch Dogs' designs. Ubisoft had never planned for any human to ever see the top side of any of these buildings. Unfortunately, I blew through all the content in about an hour and change. Madness is a zombie-themed Carmageddon run-em-over in a burnt-out environment. Here, you tackle haunting specters with a militarized front end of your vehicle to achieve specific goals, which allows you, in turn, to gain more superpowers and set zombies on fire. Psychedelic is the most on-the-nose tribute to Saints Row I've ever seen, lucidly guiding you in arcs between large trampoline flowers. The next best idea, however, is Alone. Playing entirely on the game's stealth mechanics, you need to avoid terrifying robotic torchlights as you seek out shroud generators that obscure chunks of downtown. It's a stressful game until you ramp up your offensive capabilities, allowing you to tackle patrolling sentinels with ease. Again, it's a great idea that came far too late in development. A project with all the money and the best talent in the world can still get lost without a competent plan in place. Watch Dogs is obviously a product of a ton of man-hours despite its critical errors. It's full of content and it cribbs some of the solid engineering of its open-world stablemates at Ubisoft. The game's look is a product of Ubisoft's army of international artists, but like I mentioned earlier, it's obvious that in serving 2 generations of console hardware, sacrifices had to be made. Watch Dogs isn't quite the looker that you'd expect out of a next-generation console flagship. Like any open world, it's got its share of bugs, the AI is unimaginative, and you should never really try to use the cockpit view of any vehicle you enter. Yeah, that's some pretty killer depth of field. Otherwise, the game's artistic direction is pretty incredible and realized, if not a bit stark at times. Watch Dogs, however, is a disappointment, even with lowered expectations. While Assassin's Creed could be improved by a better narrative, or Far Cry 2 could be improved by a few thick layers of polish, what twitches at this game's core isn't fundamentally entertaining. There's no 5 minutes of fun gameplay loop in Watch Dogs. There's no joy in playing this game unless you jump directly from attraction to attraction, which do their best to distract you from the game's core ideas. Left to your own devices, there's nothing fun about this game at all because of how binding the gameplay is. Hacking, the core gameplay conceit above all else, just isn't thoughtfully executed. What Watch Dogs borrows, it takes advantage of. What it formulates on its own is misspent, underutilized, or uninteresting. I know a game like this gets extensively play-tested during development, but it blows my mind that they were ready to duplicate this game millions of times over before they realized their design mistakes. It reminds me of last year's online expansion to Grand Theft Auto 5, in which Rockstar demonstrated that they had never played a fun online game before, or understood how to use the legendary series to their advantage. Ubisoft has already invested too much into Watch Dogs to back down now, but frankly, it sucks we're gonna have to wait 2 or 3 years before they can prove that they know how Watch Dogs is supposed to be fun, or even slightly entertaining at the most fundamental level, because it didn't happen this time around.
Just keep in mind my reputation's on the line here. He's paying top dollar for the best driver in Chicago.
Then he's in luck.
6 out of 10. It may not be the first, but it is the nth review. I've been your host, Nick Pfeiffer. Stay tuned for the next episode of the nth review where I dive into Microsoft and Playground Games' new Mediterranean-themed open-world racing game, Forza Horizon 2. Now it's time for the links. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out my reviews for Rise of Nations and id Software's Rage. Don't forget to check out my E3 2009 documentary, Infinite Lives: The Road to E3. Are you a fan of retail-themed dystopian thrillers? You might like my new book, Madman Love War Retail, on Kindle. Follow me in the Nth Review on Twitter, like the Nth Review on Facebook, and hey, I'll see you next time.
Friendly, aren't you? How you doing?
Excuse you.